So today we're going to continue talking about schemata, the related concept of scripts. We'll talk briefly about ideas related to visual imagery and semantic memory. And then we will finish our chapter on semantic memory by talking about, just very briefly, because they're very complicated, some of the most recent semantic memory models that have been proposed that are based on more computational sorts of principles rather than the more classical network-based models that we have been discussing. So let's continue talking about our schema, our schemata. See, I always want to say schemas plural, schemata. Last week on Friday, we were starting to talk about schema, what they are, and some of the things that they can represent. And so I had started talking about more on the individual level in terms of what schemata can represent. But we also have schemata that exist for things that are bigger than individual concepts, such as dogs. So, for example, consider meeting a new college roommate for the first time. Your knowledge of such an event is guided by a schema. In this sort of scenario, the schema would be a lot more complex, right? Beyond just your schema for a dog. So this is because your knowledge of this kind of event would include aspects of it that are more fixed or predictable, such as the setting, right? You know that if you're meeting a new college roommate, likely it's going to be either in the context of your campus or perhaps the dorm room, right? When you first walk in with your armful of belongings. You also have a sense, right, of maybe the gender of the person that you're going to be living with, the fact that they too are going to be a student like yourself. However, there are some variables too that our schemata hold that are not going to be as predictable in terms of their content, but we know that there is going to be some predictability to them nonetheless. So for example, the opening conversation, right? It's not quite as fixed as to how exactly that might go, or whether who's going to be present in that exchange. That is harder to predict and know with a general amount of certainty, but you still have a sense of, well, there may or may not be parents present, or maybe a sibling or someone, or maybe there won't be. Maybe it'll just be the two of us. Maybe the conversation will flow, or maybe it'll be a little halting or awkward. But regardless, you know that those aspects are likely to be involved as well. And so also for those of you who remember Vine or were on Vine, I don't know, that's probably an old reference now. But this idea of roommates made me think of the Vine. And they were roommates. Oh my God, they were roommates. And so that's why I put the sunglasses there, just trying to keep things fun and interesting. And as you can see, right, from this sort of in real life example, our schemata, they help fill in certain values for aspects of situations, which then helps us to make certain assumptions, right? And with assumptions, we know that they are ways of being cognitively more efficient. They're shortcuts. So for instance, let's talk about some of the assumptions that come up in the scenario of new roommate meeting. So here, right, the ages of the students weren't given. And if you don't have that much specification, you might be likely to assume that, well, these two students, maybe they're first year students, right? They're meeting for the first time. And this assumption of the students' ages would be a default value for this variable. So it'd be the default, the sort of general shortcut that your mind might take. However, this default can be overridden simply by mentioning maybe other valuable or variables, valuables, wow, other variables in the situation. So depending on, the dorm that's mentioned, if you said, oh, there were, new college roommates that were meeting in VK, right? Well, given that context, you're like, well, in VK, yeah, they're not going to be first year students. So, maybe this idea of new college roommate that you're meeting is just simply someone you haven't lived with before, right? Maybe it's a friend of a friend, or maybe it was just sort of a random pairing up that happened in the student housing office. So overall, our schemata, as you can tell, as we've been talking about, are really broad. And it's assumed that they exist at really all levels of abstraction. So we can have schemata for small parts of our knowledge, such as, well, what letter does a particular configuration form that's on the page that you're looking at? And also for a lot larger parts as well. So if I was to ask you, well, what's the theory of relativity, right? That's a lot bigger. And so some other properties of schemata that we want to know is that these are really active processes rather than passive units of knowledge. These aren't these sort of static, fixed templates that we just sort of pull up from memory and then, are really passively processed, but rather people are thought to be just really completely assessing and evaluating the fit between their current situation and then a number of relevant schemata. So it's not like you just pull up a program, you press enter and it runs. Like you might do on a computer, but rather it's a lot more active and I would say interactive with the environment that you're in. So now we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about a certain kind of schema. And so this is a schema for really routine events, and they're called scripts. So one of the best known examples of a script is going to a restaurant, which, interestingly enough, as an introvert and as someone who's more of a homebody, I never thought that I would miss going to a restaurant as much as I do in the midst of COVID. But yeah, putting this PowerPoint together made me really miss something like as routine as going to a restaurant. And so as we're talking about this script, I want you to kind of think through what happens when you go to a restaurant, sort of step by step. What happens? Who do you interact with? And so generally, most people come up with pretty similar scripts. We have pretty similar scripts in the instance of going to a restaurant, right? That tends to be a mostly universal experience. Of course, there are variations in terms of culture and setting and things like that. But for the most part, when you started thinking about what happens when you go to a restaurant, you probably thought, well, you would walk up to the front door, you're probably greeted by a host or a hostess, if that's the way that they're seating people, or you might see a sign that says, seat yourself. You would eventually sit down at a table. There would be menus present, either at the table before you already or given to you by the host or hostess. You'd be given some time to look over the menu. Someone would come and take your order. Eventually food would be brought out to you, hopefully the food that you ordered, you would eat it, you would pay your bill, you would leave, right? And so we can also think about the same sort of interactions and conversations that take place for other really routine events that we go through. So, such as attending a lecture or getting up in the morning, going grocery shopping, visiting a doctor. And so, sort of anecdotally, right, in the conversations that we have with friends and family, we know that these experiences that we have of everyday events are pretty shared or pretty similar. But there's been a lot of empirical research done to really further nuance our scripts, how they're formed, and why and how we use them. And so there's a pair of researchers in the 70s named Schenck and Abelson. And so they noticed that people's knowledge about what was involved in the process of going to a restaurant was really widely shared and structured in really similar ways. And so they then explained this similarity by developing this concept of scripts. And so they explain that scripts are memory representations that we have that are used to process and also retrieve really familiar routine events. And according to them, there are two kinds of scripts that we have. We have strong scripts and weak ones. And so with strong scripts, these involve expectations about some sort of order-based sequencing or maybe time-based sequencing. They give the example of a Japanese tea ceremony or frosting a cake as examples of more routine events. I mean, I guess Japanese tea ceremonies aren't quite as routine in comparison to frosting a cake. But these are situations in which there would be a really strong script. So that is, there'd be a step-by-step process that you would go through one after the other in order to accomplish this. Whereas in comparison, our weak scripts include really few or even maybe no expectations about the order in which things need to take place. So for example, running errands or cleaning the house, there might be some sequencing to it, right? You might prioritize your errands based on their different locations, what makes sense logistically, or how long it might take you, or who opens first or stays open the latest. But ultimately, there isn't really any sort of universal way in which you would go about doing it. It's going to be highly dependent on the person. So maybe you clean the bathroom first because you hate that and you just want to rip that Band-Aid off and get it over with. Or maybe you save that for last because you dread it so much. And also another thing to note about weak scripts is that the outcome of the actions is not affected by the order in which they're performed. So it doesn't ultimately matter the order of the aisles that you visit at the grocery store, for example, just as long as you get what you need. And so generally speaking, then these kinds of events would have what we would call weak or weaker scripts in relation to situations that have strong scripts. Another property of scripts to note is that there is a somewhat hierarchical structure. And so this is because the idea of a script is thought to be made up of scenes. So similar to a movie script, TV script, if you've been involved with plays before, they also have scripts where things are broken up into scenes. And so the idea here is that each, the script itself has a header, so a title, and then each scene has a header as well. So these are words or descriptions of a particular scene that happens. So again, our script for going to the bank, for example, that would be one script. And then perhaps there are different scenes within that script, right? You might have one script where you are withdrawing money in person, maybe it's a larger sum, and you have to go in person, or maybe you're going to get quarters from the bank to do laundry. That situation has a particular kind of scene to it that is then going to be distinct from the scene where you go to the ATM and withdraw cash. And so with these headers, the idea is once that header or sort of tag is activated, then it activates the script and the scenes within, and those are just carried out as they're sort of represented in our memory. Also, within the scenes of a script are thought to be these sort of frames or slots. And these contain what are thought to be default values. So really the sort of usual or anticipated or typical kinds of words and actions that various individuals might use sort of within the script. So an example of this might be the American greeting of, "Hi, how are you?" And if you are not from America, you wouldn't have the default value that goes along with that. If you have traveled outside of America, and if you've spoken to people who have been to America, they often comment on the fact of how strange it is that we say, "Hi, how are you?" as a greeting. And we don't actually expect people to tell us really how they're doing. You know, the default value is, "Oh, how are you?" "I'm good, how are you?" It would be very atypical for someone to say, "Well, I mean, you know, I've had a pretty bad day. You know, I woke up and I had a flat tire." You know, that is not what's in our script as Americans, so to speak. So based on these various features and properties of scripts, there have been a number of predictions that have been developed. And so, for instance, to the extent that the script does not match the actual event, someone will have difficulty understanding the event, and processing of the event will take longer. So again, if there is a mismatch with your script of greeting a stranger, you know, "Hi, how are you doing?" And all of a sudden they start telling you about, you know, their recent divorce proceedings, right? All of a sudden that is going to really take you aback. And it'll take you a little bit longer to understand what's going on and to track with the conversation. And so if we think back to the story that I read to you on Friday that Sir Frederick Bartlett had used in his meaningful memory studies. It was the Native American folk tale called War of the Goats. And some of you might have felt like it was challenging to make sense of entirely what all was happening within that story. And this is because the impact of culture on your scripts for stories made it more difficult to sort of track or keep up with the way that the story was unfolding. And so in contrast, you likely would have had an easier time following along with the story if you had come from a Native American background. And additionally, if someone is asked to recall an event that doesn't match up well with their script, there are likely going to be distortions in the form of omissions, so missing information, and also added information that wasn't originally there. And these distortions in the recall are going to be similar to those that we talked about that Sir Bartlett observed with his participants. And there's also a certain pattern of recall that we see. So atypical elements of the event, so that is elements that do not match up with our script tend to be recalled better at shorter delays. If you're going back to our kind of just more basic example of saying, hi, how are you? And maybe someone starts telling you about their divorce, right? And maybe, the 5, 10, 15 minutes after that, you might be able to remember elements of like, yeah, they told me the name of their lawyer and, which courthouse they were going to, and, sort of things like that. And then, however, as time passes, maybe a week later, right, the more typical elements will be recalled. So, you will more likely remember like, well, yeah, this guy was telling me about his divorce, and yeah, I don't know, he seemed pretty bummed about it. And so that is just an example of what happens as a consequence of time, especially in the context of our scripts, is that the things that we don't expect really stand out to us in the short term, but the things that we do expect stick with us over time. And our scripts are also thought to be useful in a variety of situations. So for instance, if you go to a new restaurant in a city that you've never been in before, you would call on your restaurant script to generally sort of know what to do, or at least look for clues for what to do, right? Maybe you go to the restaurant and you're not sure if it's self-seating or if you need to wait for somebody to greet you. But likely you would walk in, you would look around, maybe see if there are any signs or anybody who sees you, any workers who see you and come over. And so this is also can be used across situations that are similar but in different places. If you're on a road trip and you stop at McDonald's, you have a script for McDonald's, generally what you order, what's available, even though, you might be sort of in the middle of nowhere on the 5, for example, heading north, and you stop in at a McDonald's, you still generally know what to expect, and you have a particular sort of script that you can pull on. And so our scripts also allow us to make a number of inferences or assumptions. So consider this story again, sort of going back to our food-based examples and scripts. So here's a short story. So Tim really wanted a chicken fried steak. So he went to a restaurant and ordered it. Finally, he asked for the check, paid it, and left. Other apparently omitted information can be inferred by the use of the restaurant script that we know. So for instance, we can assume that Tim entered the restaurant and was seated, that someone took and delivered his food to him, that someone cooked the steak, right? He didn't get food poisoning likely from it, someone cooked it, that he brought money with him when he entered the restaurant, and so on. So the story about Tim didn't need to include all of this because it gave us enough information to call up the appropriate script, or going to a restaurant script. And then that script filled in the rest. So researchers Bauer, Black, and Turner, they wanted to investigate how much people typically use scripts. So they first asked their participants to write down their scripts for a number of events, such as going to a restaurant, visiting the doctor. And they compared these scripts across their participants, and they found a high degree of overlap. There's this high degree of similarity in what people mentioned. Participants generally agreed about which of the characters involved that they wanted to describe, which sort of props or physical objects and actions that they wanted to mention, and also the order in which the different actions would occur. These investigators also found a high degree of agreement when it came to the level of description that was used. So for example, most people would mention eating the food more generally, rather than saying picking up a spoon, dipping it into the soup, raising the spoon to lips and sipping. Rather, they would just say, yeah, they went to Panera, ordered soup, and they ate it. These researchers also conducted another study in which they showed that if information from a story was presented in scrambled order, that is, if they mixed it all up, people would still recall it in the order that their scripts would expect them to. And then in another experiment that these researchers did, they presented their participants with 18 short stories that were based on scripts. So here's an example of one that they used. John was feeling bad today, so he decided to go see the family doctor. He checked in with the doctor's receptionist and then looked through several medical magazines that were on the table by his chair. Finally, the nurse came and asked him to take off his clothes. The doctor was very nice to him. He eventually prescribed some pills for John. Then John left the doctor's office and headed home. After reading these stories, the participants were either asked to recall the stories, so freely recall them, or to recognize the sentences that had been within the story. And so, as predicted, participants' recall contained elements that were not reported in the story, but were in the relevant script for that situation. So I'll bet that many of you, after hearing that short story about John, you may, quote unquote, remember that he was sitting in a waiting room before seeing the doctor, even though I didn't explicitly say that in the story. The information that I gave you, that he looked through several medical magazines that were on the table by his chair, was assimilated into or absorbed into your script of how doctor visits tend to go, as there are often side tables with medical magazines on them in waiting rooms. Additionally, do you think that the police were caught on John after he left the doctor's office? Maybe for indecent exposure. If you're confused about why I'm bringing this up, it's because the story never tells us that John puts his clothes back on after seeing the nurse. Your mind filled in that information based on your doctor office script. So at this point in our lives, we have gone through enough doctor's visits that we know, okay, physical exams generally include being asked to take certain clothing off, and then eventually being reinstructed to put your clothes back on. And you also were likely influenced by your script about what constitutes socially acceptable behavior, such as wearing clothes in public. So even through your experiences of going to the doctor, right, you likely would redress, even if you hadn't been instructed to, even if the doctor came back in and said, okay, you're good to go, follow up with the front desk, and we'll see you in a year from now, take care of yourself, bye. And you were still naked, you have the script of, oh yes, I need to put my clothes on before I go out to the public. And so in summary, although they're not necessarily formal models of how our semantic memory works, schemata and scripts are still important concepts that illustrate the efficiency, the organization, and the top-down processing that is assumed to play a pretty big role in our semantic recall. However, because of their efficiency and the increased automaticity that's involved in their functioning, our dependence on these sorts of mental shortcuts can sometimes lead us to make embarrassing social errors, such as saying, you too, after the movie ticket taker tells us to enjoy our meal, or the server that drops off our food at our table tells us to enjoy our food. So now that we've talked about schemata and scripts, we're going to shift gears a little bit because the ideas regarding how our semantic memories are represented in our minds haven't explicitly talked about the role that our visual system plays in this and how we might go about storing and retrieving the associated visual imagery that accompanies our factual and conceptual memory. And so a researcher by Alan Piveo originated what's called the dual coding hypothesis of memory. And he did this to try to better explain how the human mind goes about organizing our semantic memory based on the format of the information that's coming in. And so according to this researcher, long-term memory contains two distinct coding systems or codes for information representation. So one of the codes is verbal, and it contains information about an item's abstract linguistic meaning. So the verbal code, the name of that item. And so the other code involves imagery, so mental pictures of some sort that represent what the item actually looks like. And so items that are to be remembered can be coded as either verbal or visual labels. And in some cases, they can be given both. And so Piveo's idea here is that pictures and concrete words give rise to both verbal labels and verbal images. So that is, they have two possible internal codes or mental representations. So as an example of this, computer. Computer can have the verbal label, its name associated with it, and it also conjures up a mental image that goes along with it. However, abstract words, that is, words that don't correspond to some sort of physical, tangible object in real life, so such as freedom or diversity or justice, right? It's not like you can go to the store and buy justice, for example, but you can go to the store and buy cookies. And so in the instance of abstract words, we only have one kind of code that's available to us, and that is the verbal label for that. We don't have a visual label as well. And so here's just a diagram just sort of showing this idea of this dual coding hypothesis. You have the word that is coming in, the verbal label, and it gets assigned to your knowledge of that. And in some instances, you also will have an image that also accompanies your knowledge of that item or idea. And so let's talk about some of the evidence that Piveo found for this. So in a study in 1965, participants were asked to learn one of four kinds of lists of word pairs. So these words were nouns, so person, place, or thing. And so one of the lists included word pairs in which both referred to concrete objects. So objects that exist in real life, you can touch them, interact with them. So for example, for the concrete word pair, maybe it was book and table. And then the second list, which was made up of a word pair that had first a concrete word and then after that an abstract word. So for example, chair and justice was an option. Some other participants got the opposite of that, where the first word was abstract, like freedom, and the second was concrete, like dress. And then the last kind of list contained pairs of totally abstract nouns. So for example, beauty and truth. And so you had this combination of concrete and or abstract words. And participants' performances showed that the combination, having two concrete words in the word pair, such as book and table, resulted in the best recall. And then this was followed by word pairs that were concrete and abstract, and then followed by abstract and concrete. And finally, the worst recall happened with words that were both abstract in the word pair. And so Piveo made sense of this by way of this dual coding hypothesis. And so his explanation was, whenever possible, participants spontaneously came up with visual images of the word pairs that they were given. And so this formation of visual images was thought to be easiest with the concrete nouns. And Paveo assumed that because our visual imagery increases as a function of concreteness, the more concrete the noun is, that is, the more it actually exists in real life and we can interact with it, the richer the image and the more elaborate then the internal code. And so this was suggested to help explain why pictures, which are very concrete, are often remembered better than words. And so when items are coded by both images and verbal labels, as is the case for concrete words, so again, book, table, computer, the chances of the person retrieving those words are better. Because if the person forgets the verbal label, he or she might still be able to access the visual label, or vice versa. However, items that are coded only by verbal labels are at a disadvantage. That is, abstract words are in trouble, or your recall for abstract words is in trouble if the verbal label is forgotten or misplaced. You don't have a backup plan. And so Paveo also believed that that perhaps the first word in a word pair is what he called a conceptual peg. It's sort of the hook or the anchor point on which the second word is associated. And so in this sense, the first word serves as a sort of mental anchor. And this is suggested for why the result, if we go back here, for why the word pairs that were concrete and then abstract were better recalled in comparison to words that were abstract and then concrete. Because in the case of the concrete abstract word pairs, the concrete word at the beginning of the word pair served as the sort of tangible, concrete mental anchor to which you could associate an abstract word. So for example, chair then became the mental anchor for justice. Whereas if you had abstract first, such as freedom, freedom was a lot more difficult to have as a mental anchor because it was not as concrete. So I have mentioned in previous lectures that the case of KC, his initials, provides us with evidence that there's this kind of distinction between our episodic memory and our semantic memory, both conceptually, but also when it comes to the brain structures that are involved as well. And so we're going to revisit the case of KC just to sort of help further round out our discussion of semantic memory. And so we'll take a deeper look into how his semantic memory was affected by the brain damage that he sustained following a motorcycle accident. And so after the accident, Casey lost most of his past memories and could make almost no new memories. So he was having both anterograde and retrograde amnesia. And interestingly enough, the neuroscientist who was studying him, Endel Tolving, who you might remember has been a pretty big name in the field of memory, Tolving began to study KC. And Tolving found that KC was able to remember semantic information. So even though his episodic memory was damaged, his semantic memory was intact. So he was able to still remember the difference between stalactites and stalagmites in caves, which frankly, I am not remembering off the top of my head. So I'm going to look that up right now. So a stalactite is what hangs down from the roof of a cave, whereas a stalagmite is what sticks up from the bottom of a cave. Hopefully you've heard those words before. If not, you have 2 new words to add to your vocabulary. His semantic memory was also being intact also counted for, well, how he still knew that there's a difference between spares and strikes in bowling. And so Tolvien found that these were memories that were really devoid or stripped of all of their context and emotion. The work that Tolvien did in this area provided us with really strong evidence that our episodic and our semantic memories rely on different kinds of brain circuits and brain structures. And so we found that the hippocampus helps to record both types of memories initially, so that is both semantic and episodic, and also helps retain them for the medium term. So still sort of in this in-between place between our short-term and our long-term memory. The hippocampus is helping us with retention. And the hippocampus also helps us access old episodic memories. But in order to access our old semantic memories, the brain seems to use an area called the hippocampus, referred here on the slide as the hippocampal cortex. This is an extension of the hippocampus. And in the case of KC, whose parahippocampi, that is, hippocampi is the plural for hippocampus, because he still had both of his parahippocampi intact after the accident, he was able to remember semantic knowledge. So he could remember that to win the game of pool, you needed to sink the 8 ball at the very end, even though he still had no memory whatsoever of ever having played pool before in his life. And interestingly enough, while a healthy hippocampus usually records our new semantic information and again is involved with that. The parahippocampus actually can very slowly absorb new information as well. And so even though there is this evidence that these are distinct memory processes that have distinct structures involved, we still see some evidence for a little bit of overlap. And so as an example of this, interestingly enough, in the case of KC, so he spent years of reshelving books at the library, volunteering there. He eventually learned the Dewey Decimal System, which is what's used to organize books in the library, even though he wasn't able to tell you why he knew that. He wasn't able to say, oh yeah, I use the Dewey Decimal System when I go and volunteer at the library. But he had slowly learned that semantic, or those semantic facts that are involved in the Dewey Decimal System, how it is organized. So now we are going to move on to the very last set of models that we are going to talk about within semantic memory. And so if we think back to the models that we've talked about so far in terms of feature comparison, hierarchical, all of those sort of more network-based models, we can think of the metaphor as a library, as something that can help us sort of understand the assumptions and the structures of the models that we've discussed up to this point. And so the idea here is that each piece of information that has been stored in long-term memory exists as a particular item. It's stored in a particular location, much like a book in a library. So when you're going to look up a book in a library, you can type in the specific title and it will tell you, oh, that's over in the maybe it's over in the references area, or maybe it's over in the history area. And it also gives you the specific sort of address or location of where it's located. So you can go and you can take that book off the shelf. However, we need to sort of get away from that sort of metaphor and way of thinking when we're thinking about these more recently developed models of memory. They're generally referred to as connectionist models. And because they make very different assumptions about the structure of neural networks and information representations, this sort of library retrieval metaphor isn't going to be very useful. And so let's talk about then what exactly these connection models of memory propose and understand. This is in the words of James McClellan. So he's actually one of the pioneers of these connectionist models in cognition. And so with connectionist models, he argued that they let go of the idea that items are stored in memory as such. So instead, the fundamental idea is that what's stored in memory is a set of changes in the instructions that neurons have been sending to each other, which then affects the pattern of activity that can be constructed. When an event is experienced, it creates a pattern of activity over a set of processing units. This pattern of activity is considered to be the representation of the event. The formation of this pattern of activity provides the trigger for the creation of the instruction. The set of instructions is then stored in the connections among the units, where it is available for use in the construction of subsequent patterns of activity. Such reconstructed representation corresponds to a recollection. The patterns themselves are not stored and hence are not really retrieved. So rather, recall is not about retrieval, but it's about reconstruction. So I know that this is a lot more abstract, and it's also based on computational principles, which are abstract in and of themselves, and also are likely principles that you are not familiar with. But let's look at a more concrete example to see if we can further illustrate the difference between the more classic network-based models and the connectionist models. So here, this is a diagram from another cognitive textbook that I have. I think it does a really great job of providing a visual. So at the top diagram here is hopefully something that looks familiar at this point, as we've been talking about semantic memory models. And so this is more of a semantic network model. The bottom diagram presents a connectionist model of the same concepts. So both diagrams are showing the same concepts, but just represented in different ways. So we can go back to our tried and true concept of a robin. Okay, so in the network model, we see that the node for robin is here. And so in this setup, it is represented as its own node, and then there are these interconnections to these other nodes. However, in the bottom diagram, the idea of a robin, which you can see this blue filled in bubble here, is then thought to correspond to some sort of ability that is possessed by that creature or to certain aspects. So then here, the darkened units that we see in the bottom diagram are units that have been activated. And the idea here is that a connectionist network learns over trials that when the unit for Robin becomes active, then the pattern that has been established, that is other certain associated units, should become active as well. So for example, we see here a Robin can, so this is speaking to its different abilities. It can grow, it can move, it can fly. However, there's not a connection that is being activated here with the idea of swim, right? We know that robins can't swim. They can, maybe dip their heads in the water, but they are not capable of swimming. So how does then this sort of trial and learning pattern happen? So essentially, the idea here is it's kind of like machine learning. So sort of this trial and error, just repeated associations over time. But a connectionist network must be taught to develop these patterns of activation through many trials with lots of training examples. And so this is a very, very complex idea, and I don't want us to get too bogged down in the details. So we're just going to talk about it more generally. And essentially what I want you to take away from this is that the connectionist models posit a different way of not only representing semantic memory, but also a different way in which our semantic memories are formed. So let's go back to our diagrams here. So with the connectionist model, initially, the connections that are between the units in the bottom diagram, there are these sort of weights or this importance that is given to them. And this is based on activation. So training occurs by presenting a specific example, what connection model researchers call an input pattern, to the network, which then generates a particular output. So for example, at the beginning of training a connectionist model to know more about birds, specifically robins, the example of robin might become activated. And then in connection to that activation, the units of can and the word pretty over here, and fly and let's see, branches down here might then become activated. And so this output is then compared to sort of a target output or the goal output. And so network connections are then adjusted based on this comparison. And after sort of each trial of learning, then each associated activated unit gets assigned a value. So with robin and can, swim, for example. Well, robin and can as units would be given certain weights, but swim would be given less weight. It's essentially telling the system, hey, this is less important. This is a less important connection to the unit of robin and can than maybe is a fly. Maybe fly is going to get a lot more of a weight to then help the network to better recognize the connections between units in this model. Again, these connection weights between units are adjusted over time. So it's really this idea of trial and error learning, where you are getting feedback about what is right or wrong. You can maybe think of it sort of based on grades, right? So the lower the grade, then the model knows, oh, okay, all right, that's not quite as important of a connection. So, maybe swim gets a D minus, whereas grow and move and fly, as we've been talking about, they all get A's. And so in connection to robin, then the network is like, Oh, okay. Those are more important. Those are a bigger deal in this instance. And so again, this is all very abstract and more computer based. But again, it does help to give us an idea of how learning happens in terms of trial and error, and how our brains respond to learning, how we begin to be able to differentiate a robin from a canary, and do so efficiently. Again, you can see all of these different interconnections between units, between parts of concepts. Um, and by assigning weights, it helps to really streamline responses and connections along these patterns of association. So just to recap really quickly, there have been several different proposals for how semantic knowledge is represented. And the debate still continues over the positives and negatives of feature models and hierarchical models and spreading activation and connectionist models. But however, the biggest takeaway is that the discovery of certain properties and functions such as semantic priming, the idea of spreading activation, and experimental methods that have wow, that have specifically been used to test semantic memory, have all contributed to our understanding of the principles by which our knowledge is stored and retrieved, and also how we continue to grow in that knowledge as we go through life and go through experiences.